Welcome to Ideas of India, a podcast where we examine academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and this is the 2023 Job Market series, where I speak with young scholars entering the academic job market about their latest research on India. I spoke with Sarath Pillai, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for the Advanced Study of India at University of Pennsylvania. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Chicago, a Master's of Studies in Law from Yale Law School, and an MA in history from the University of Delhi, and a postgraduate diploma in Archives and Records Management from the National Archives of India. We discussed his job market paper titled German Lessons, Comparative Constitutionalism, States as Rights, and Federalist Imaginaries in the Interwar India, recently published in Comparative Studies in Society and History. We spoke about how the views of the princely states on federalism and constitutionalism are different from the view of the Indian nationalists, the influence of German thought on India in the early 20th century, subnationalism and federalism in modern-day India, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit mercatus.org/podcasts. Hi, Sarath. Thanks so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here.
I'm thrilled to be here, and thanks for having me.
Your job market paper in particular is something, one, it's an area I wasn't aware of at all and just got to learn so much. You basically describe and explain the influence of German history and German constitutionalism and constitutional theory and how it influenced Indian federalists, especially those engaging in constitution making for princely states, which are regional monarchies in pre-independent India. And to me, the core of your argument seems to be that from the perspective of the princely states, a central or a unitary form of government is not very suited to India as a whole because the region has so much variation. But also, for their own interests, it's not particularly suited. It's going to directly, infringe upon their powers and their sovereignty and their sort of, operational authority. And because of this, a federation of the kind that the princely states wanted was always going to be fundamentally incompatible with a British-style parliamentary democracy. Does that sort of capture the fundamental issue of what was the thinking at that time?
Yes, I think that's a great way to put it. Let me begin by saying that there are two things that I'm attempting to do in that paper. So the first is an overarching contextualization of the 1930s constitutional moment. And one of the things that I want to say is that rather than seeing discourses around federalism or constitutionalism as beginning in 1946 to 50 time period, which is a time when Indian Constituent Assembly meets, there is a prehistory of these concepts and ideas being debated. So that is a larger framework of this paper, which is to kind of really bring alive the 1930s, where there is a vigorous debate of concepts like federalism, constitutionalism, what is parliamentary democracy, and so on, outside of the framework of the nation state. So rather than kind of anachronistically placing the nation state in the 1930s and 40s, which many accounts do, and what I'm trying to say is how does constitutional debates and how does federal thinking and constitutional thinking look like in the 1930s when there is not a pre-given endpoint to these debates. So that is a larger context. And within that, I'm interested in specifically seeing the debates around federalism and federation. What are the kind of stakes involved in these debates? What are the ideas that are debated in this time period as opposed to, say, in the 1950s? So first of all, the people involved in these debates are very different from the people that you see in the 1950s or late 1940s. So the key players in these debates are the princely states, the leaders of the princely states, as well as the Muslim leaders. Even though I don't go into great detail about Muslim federal thought in this article, I think I mentioned maybe a page or two about it. In fact, I actually hope to write another article about Muslim federal thought just in the 1930s, what were the kind of issues that they were debating. So the main thing that the princely states were concerned with was exactly preservation of their sovereignty. But how do you do that? that cannot be done in a Westminster-style parliamentary democracy, even though UK is a constitutional monarchy. I mean, there is the institution of kingship, but they were not really enamored by that model at all. And they were rather interested in the German model because in 1871, Germany had a federal constitution. And the significance of that constitution was that it allowed the German princely states to retain their sovereignty. So that was one. And also have differential relationship with the federal center. So all the constitutional units did not have to be the same way as, for instance, it is in the case of United States. Every state has, the same representation in the Senate or so on. So that was something that the princely states were really interested in. So just as the Muslim leaders were also interested in this German model, because it allowed for cultural peculiarities at the same time as preservation of sovereignty. So I think the sovereignty question is at the heart of the debates on federalism from the princely states in the 1930s. And I think that is the kind of gesture that I'm trying to make.
I think it's important to note at this point that though the debates you're talking about are happening in the early 1930s, the sort of German republic that they are talking about, it predates that time period by many decades, right? So this discussion is happening in the interwar years. It's happening just before sort of the rise of the Third Reich as we know it, this sort of, overly centralized sort of global imperialist, ascendancy of the German republic. So I think that's a useful thing to highlight. How does this thought disappear precisely because of what happened to Germany sort of by the end of the decade? Mm-hmm. Clearly that federation breaks down, and quite spectacularly so. And Germany also becomes yet another model of an imperial power. So is that the reason that this thinking just falls by the wayside, or is it because of other things that are happening in India?
So that's a great question. And the answer to that is, in constitutional thinking and when people debate constitutional models, as you know, they are not really concerned about it as a living model so much. So these are really about comparative constitutional thought of ideas that already existed or were practiced. So these people, all of them are barristers and lawyers, are very highly learned people who are engaged in these debates. So they were very aware that this was a model that had already ended. And the Weimar Constitution, which was already in place, people were writing, had already taken a unitary turn from the kind of federal times that these people were talking about. So it is not so much about the existence of existing federal models, as opposed to the fact that there are similar historical conditions and legal and constitutional conditions that existed in other places, even at other times. So the fact that Germany had princely states and Germany had similar questions in the late 19th century is what they're interested in, and not so much whether that is still the case right now. So that sense I get from the materials. Yeah.
No, that makes perfect sense. The other thing that occurred to me when I was reading your paper, some of the references, we know K.M. Panikkar because he was also in the Constituent Assembly of India, but you're looking at the work by White, by K.M. Panikkar, by Haksar, and some of the work that they rely on, it predates another important German thinker of that time, which is Carl Schmitt. And to me, the Schmitt critique of parliamentary democracy, which is that it requires a very high degree of homogeneity to succeed, it seems crucial to what you are saying about what was going on with Indian federal thought, right? Because they fundamentally had the same issue with the British colonial state. This was highly centralized unitary model. Even if you bring in some kind of voting, it is, to accommodate, different regions or some kind of variation, you're still going to flatten it out by imposing this homogeneous electoral parliamentary system on it. So is that another thought that is coming in? Like, are all these learnings taking place simultaneously?
That's a great question and a great thought. So what is interesting about this is, I always get asked when I present this research in front of European historians and non-South Asia historians, let's put it that way. So sometimes they ask whether these people actually had connections with the Weimar state. Did they actually talk to them? Did they know? Did they read Schmidt and so on? So there is a larger global European context of anti-parliamentarism and anti-democracy in place at this point in time. In fact, there are researchers looking at that. I'm particularly thinking of, I think Tejas Parashar's book has just come out about, the critique of kind of representative democracy. So that context is very important. The context of no uncritical acceptance, or the context of critiquing parliamentary democracy, which is very hard to accept when we think of in the nationalist framework, because we think that was always the case. Everyone liked parliamentary democracy all the time. So someone like Schmidt or someone like Panikkar come together on that context, so that they both are critical of parliamentary democracy. But what is significant, in fact, I engage with Schmidt's work in a great fashion in my dissertation. In fact, I find him very useful to think about the importance of the conception of the political or the conception of sovereignty. So what I find interesting, and especially his work on constitutional theory, which is a book I think always gets kind of overlooked as opposed to his political theology or the conception of the political. So he kind of talks about, how federation always brings about the question of sovereignty, and how that question is very difficult to resolve in a federation. Because federation brings about the classic question whether the sovereignty lies with the center or with the constituent states. In some way, these princely states leaders are very much aware of the question of sovereignty. So rather than, I think there is a greater scholarship, especially in post-colonial societies, that kind of read federalism through multiculturalism, for instance, whether you have the freedom to practice your religion, language, and so on. But what we see in this moment is not just an investment in cultural question, but political question, which is the question of sovereignty. We are a state. Can we have our sovereignty? Or for the Muslims, we are a nation, and our province have to have sovereignty. So I think sovereignty is at the base of these debates. And I think to that extent, someone like Schmidt is so relevant in seeing some of these questions, even though they don't align very much in terms of chronology. They come in different time periods. Yeah.
No, I think this is super interesting. And you're absolutely right. We never hear the question of sovereignty when it comes to states, because once you have walked away from that and you've created a union of states, now the battle is for autonomy. Or for decentralization. It is not for sovereignty, because sovereignty is off the table now. Now all the states are battling it out for autonomy, when it comes to provision of public goods, or how much of the public finance that they raise they're allowed to hold on to, right? How much can they dictate what their local government does? Can they refuse to implement a centrally sponsored scheme? But to me, these are questions of the level of decentralization and autonomy, because sovereignty is now only with the Union of India as we know it, right? And that's the big break post 1950 that takes place in India. I mean, it may have set in even pre 1950, but this is a big one. I mean, there's an interesting distinction I found, which I'm not able to articulate well, that was there both in your Germany paper and also, your paper on Travancore, on the difference between a union and a federation. And this difference is completely underappreciated now. We just don't know it. So can you tell me constitutionally what is the difference between these two words, and also in the context of how this played out in the debates in the interwar years that you're talking about?
That's a great topic that I always find interest in, and especially in explaining that as well. So from a purely constitutional perspective, and depending on who you read or the kind of country that you look at, union in most contexts basically means that constituent states do not have sovereignty. They kind of delegate the sovereignty to the central government. So one example that the nationalists, including, influential members of the Constituent Assembly like N. Gopalaswamy Iyengar, for instance, thought about was the Union of South Africa Act, which was 1909. Which was a parliamentary act, and it was for a union. So the Constitution basically created a union. And in that, you will see that the sovereignty really rests with the parliament. So the idea that in a union, the sovereignty rests with a parliament or single unit, as opposed to in a federation where sovereignty is divided, is one that primarily distinguishes federation and union. And in the Indian context, as you know, Ambedkar was very reluctant to use the phrase federation in constitution. And in fact, he said that in the Constituent Assembly. And when I was reading the private papers of B.N. Rao, I was quite struck by the fact that he had wanted union to be there in the draft constitution. In fact, in my longish review of Aravind Langovin's book, which appeared in New Rambler, I write about this issue, the union versus a federation terminology, and how B.N. Rao was on the other side on this question compared to Ambedkar and other nationalists. So in India, the idea that federation would mean that there is more than one seat of sovereignty was a sensitive question. And thereby, to the extent that even people were reluctant to use the word federation in constitution. So we ended up having union. And in Ambedkar's language, it is an indestructible union. And it is a union that doesn't permit secession. So the states cannot secede from the union. It is a permanent union. So, so I think in some ways, that is the kind of difference. And South Africa really plays a role as a kind of ideational model, at least for some of these people, in thinking about, because that was a colony and that was legislation made by the British Parliament. Some people kind of looked at the 1935 Act was in comparison with the Union of South Africa Act, which was a unitary constitution, whereas our 1935 Act was a federal constitution. Yeah.
No, the other reason I ask is that these words have now kind of flipped in one sense, and I mean that in the sense of the European Union, which, if we use your terminology, is actually a federation, right? The individual countries never gave up their sovereignty. They just decided to delegate certain things or pool certain things to create a common market. Whereas India is known as a federal state, right? United States is a federal state. So in some sense, it just feels like, these things come in waves in different centuries, and the very specific context in which the words are used, they almost flip, if you look at it 100 years later.
Yeah, that's a good point. And in fact, I reflected on the debate between union and center. So in India, there is a debate between, for instance, in Tamil Nadu, there was a controversy whether the state government should be using the terminology central government at all. And they decided that they won't use the terminology central government. In fact, I wrote an article in the India in Transition series for CASI reflecting on this question. And I basically argued that central government is equally a historical term, especially in nationalist thought. So the nationalists have been using, in Nehru Report and other nationalist document, the idea of central government, even though it doesn't exist in the Constitution. For Constitution, it is a union government.
It is Union of India, yeah.
So one more terminology is important for India: federal, union, and central. So all three kind of, are related to each other. They are posited against each other. Sometimes they sit together and so on. Yeah.
I mean, there are two parts to this. One, in a lot of constitutional theory and jurisprudence, there's this sense that there's a constitutional moment, right? Some magic happens when the constitution is adopted, which is a clean structural break between, the past and the future as we think of it. As opposed to another view, which is that constitution making happens over decades and centuries, right? And to me, this very much feels like an inheritance of the latter or rather a symptom of the latter school of thought, which is India was already heavily centralized because there was a tiny group of, British civil servants, governing things from Whitehall and the India office. And, further down, of course, they had officers in India. And then the people who take over that official machinery are either people like V.P. Menon and B.N. Rao, who were both incidentally involved in the 1935, Government of India Act, and how do we operationalize that in India, especially when it comes to provinces and, the federal status and so on. And the people who are elected to the Constituent Assembly are basically, not all of them are elected. There are many people who are sent from the princely states. But those who are elected based on the Government of India Act 1935, right? This is the model that sets up the provincial elections. So it seems like there is a longer history to who is writing these rules and how they are interpreting these words. So it might say Union of India, but it has this massive centralizing tendency because of the machinery that has been inherited over 100 years, and also by those who happen to be the operators of that machinery at that point in time.
I think that's again a great way to see it. And so there are certain scholars who see the Indian Constitution as a break with the past. So it's a kind of a radical rupture. So the social question, for instance, Granville Austin kind of way of thinking about the Constitution as a radical document, as a social revolutionary document. So in that model, there is a rupture, there is a break with the colonial past. So, but I think as a historian would like to see continuities more than rupture, because one just cannot ignore the fact that 2/3 of the Government of India Act figures in the Government of India, in the Indian Constitution, even though we don't have much scholarship on it. So even the Indian legal history or Indian constitutional history sometimes kind of take this rupture of the making of independent India as a very formative moment. So much so that it even kind of, sets a benchmark for scholarship pre versus post in really clear terms. Yeah, but I think one of the things that I'm trying to do through my research is to actually make this problem of EC rupture or not seeing the 1930s and 40s as formative for 1950 more complicated. And I think, it is true that these actors were sidelined and silenced in many ways. The princely states were holed up in 1950, and they really did not have any, great power at that time. That's true. The Muslims had separated and gone away to Pakistan for sure. But I think the specter of these ideas really haunted the members of the Constituent Assembly. So I think we need to kind of see how these kind of ideas would have played a role, even as a kind of a specter, even if it was only that, even if there was no pure political potential of princely states remaining independent, even though legally it was possible. But one could, if you are a realist or if you're really interested in political realism, you could say that the princely states could never have been independent,
Yeah, and for me, I think some of this just comes from a bit of a historical accident in scholarship, in that Granville Austin is the first one to really pull together a history of Indian constitution making as it happened between 1946 and 1950, right? And basically, he's relying on materials that were perfectly documented at a moment in time. This is a generation, he comes in about 15 years later. The people who have, in one sense, written the Constitution are slowly fading away. Many of them have passed on. Many of them are no longer active in politics. So it's really the first moment it is important to even sit down and write it as a history. And the person who happens to do it is doing it off of RP papers, right? Who is basically the president of the assembly. And so that is the source material for the first historical telling of what happened. And I think that became the anchor in one sense, right? Everything else was either a critique of that or a continuation of that. And it's taken us almost 50, 60 years to come out of it, right? So for a very long time, that was the existing scholarship. Everything is post-independence, or at least post-1946, Constituent Assembly debates and so on. And now I feel like there's this big revival that is taking place almost, right? For instance, I learned recently from a paper that Rohit Dey and Ornit Shani have written about how there weren't like one or two, but hundreds of different constitutions that were in the process of being written by princely states. And these are sometimes tiny princely states. Like, I'm not just talking about, the state of Travancore or the Nizam or something like, people who were really important and powerful. Some of these are really tiny, and they're still figuring out their question of sovereignty, right? You have Rahul Sagar and his recent work on rediscovering T. Madhava Rao. In fact, T. Madhava Rao's draft constitution is in the appendix of his volume. You have your colleague Arvind Elangovan, who is looking at this through the lens of what B.N. Rao was trying to do in making the 1935 Act more compatible with the existing state machinery and operationalizing it for the provinces and so on. So I feel like we're sort of rediscovering the past in a very different way, right? Do you get the same feeling, one, given that you're kind of in it? And second, to what do you think we owe this revival, almost sort of like against the Austinian narrative?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I am very fresh from having spent 3 weeks at Princeton University Library reading the private papers of Granville Austin. In fact, I got a grant from the library, so I spent 3 weeks just reading his papers. So there are 40 boxes of Granville Austin papers at Princeton University Library. And I went through each of them. I was quite surprised that, it was like, his conception of India constitution, as you rightly mentioned, was so narrowed down to the Constituent Assembly and to the members of the Constituent Assembly. So he was in good, close contact with many of the members of the Constituent Assembly at that time and to the members of the Constituent Assemblies, because he was researching in the late 1950s. So he had personal access to the papers of many of these former Constituent Assembly members. So in some ways, it is not surprising that someone like Austin would come out with a highly nationalist account of the making of Indian Constitution. So his first book, it doesn't spend any time on the princes or the Muslim states or the Muslim minorities and so on. So seeing the Indian Constitution as a consensual document is Austin's contribution to it. And I think people are questioning that now. So, for instance, Aravind has an article on the non-national History Compass article. I think that is happening now precisely because, I think there is a greater kind of scrutiny on Indian Constitution now, for one. And also there is a greater recognition that these Indian Constitution was not a unanimous apolitical document. In fact, it was shaped by political processes and ideas that exceeded the Indian Constituent Assembly. So I think one of the things that Rohit and Ornit are also trying to show is that we need to look at what's happening outside of the Constituent Assembly, right? So that is important. And one more thing that I would say about that question, purely from a historian's perspective, is that what I find interesting about these debates and as a player in these debates is the possibility of thinking about constitution and law outside of the framework of the nation state and nationalism. So, I was interviewing for a postdoc position last year at a top law school, and I had a very difficult time explaining how would constitutionalism look like from a non-nation state perspective. So that made me realize that even in the United States, with advanced legal scholarship, this is a question that kind of doesn't really get automatically accepted or related with, in the sense that, law as a discipline is very nationalist and nation state oriented. So, but when you look at the 1930s and 40s, what we really see is people thinking about constitutionalism outside of the framework of the nation state, outside of the framework of nationalism, outside of the framework of democracy. So we are also thinking of recovering an alternative constitutionalism, which is neither nationalist, nor democratic, nor parliamentary. So I think in this new revival, especially through the prehistory of federalism, I'm hoping that, there would be space for thinking about legal history through actors who were not nationalist or people who did not imagine nation state and parliamentary democracy as the endpoint. And they were very legal. These were very legal debates. So we cannot really kind of see, law and constitution as only leading to nationalism and nation state.
So I'll tell you what my hunch is on the reason for the revival. And I think it's been long coming. I think for the longest time, we associated nationalism with some form of liberalism because the nationalist movement was anti-colonial. And we know that the colonial powers heavily infringed on individual liberty, and so on. Now, I think once you have no colonialism and you have nationalism and constitutionalism, there is now a very strange tension between the two, right? The allegiance to the nation state is very different from the allegiance to constitutional principles that guarantee individual liberty and so on and so forth. In the midst of this, there is obviously the question of, federalism, which is once again against this idea of nationalism, which requires this uniformity to be imposed across all different states, all different regions. In fact, for the first 4 or 5 decades, it's a centrally planned economy. And then there is a break away from that. So to me, it almost feels like in the last 30 years, this has been long coming, because we are finally realizing that nationalism, when it was anti-colonial, can be liberal, can be compatible with federalism and so on. But nationalism, post-colonialism, is not quite compatible with all the other constitutional values that we're looking for. So now suddenly the nationalist lens of looking at the Constitution is not so great. It's now full of flaws. We can run a truck through this, right?
Yeah, I think that as a historian, the way to look at that is how at different time periods in history, how opposing groups of people embrace ideas. So for instance, this is happening in the United States too, right? I mean, who are the people who support state autonomy when the Republicans are in power, as opposed to the Democrats are in power, So even something like the powers of the state can become a shifting category in the United States. So just like that, I mean, today, someone like Partha Chatterjee, who's a subaltern historian, is writing about federalism and federation. But they did not really engage with that question when the subaltern studies group was in existence or when they were writing about it. So what is happening is like federalism is becoming a site for resisting authoritarianism and Hindu majoritarianism and so on, in a way that people did not really think about in the 50s or 60s and so on. So there is a kind of shift that happens with these ideas, and who are the people who are propelling these ideas at different periods in history. And I think there's no greater example than federalism and nationalism and all these big isms that keep changing. Yeah.
No, but for me, the interesting thing is that the same things that, for instance, you said the subaltern historians are raising now, or the political theorists are raising about federalism today, are the kinds of questions that White and Huxer and Panikkar are raising 90 years before. So I think to me, that's the interesting thing. I mean, they're trying to get the same outcome, which is a certain kind of, sovereignty is part of that, which is it's the means to the ends that they want. But the end is that they want to have control over their lives and destiny, right? And away from this kind of authoritarianism. So they're actually, in a sense, engaging in a very similar project. Of course, now through the modern lens, it seems not so cool because they're not all for elections. They're not all for universal adult franchise, right? I mean, things that we now just take for granted across the world, especially in India, those things are just not being discussed quite in the same positive light. They're very skeptical about those questions. So it feels like, they're very regressive, but actually they're dealing with the exact same questions that you are wrestling with in one sense.
That's a good way to put it. And I think I completely take that. But there could be some kind of level of discomfort, in kind of associating purely with the Panikkar or White view of thinking about these questions, precisely because they were not committed to democracy the way the people who are debating federalism today are. Democracy is unquestionable. I mean, no one wants to have the princess walking around in India anymore. So there are certain fundamental questions that differentiate this moment from that moment. But I think what it also shows is that these are very malleable concepts and ideas, which in some way we have forgotten because we have been given to believe federalism in so and so ways, or, nationalism as a nation state, so on. So, yeah, but I do find it really interesting how the same idea can be debated by people in different ideological positions or political positions and in different time periods. That is not to suggest that it is all the same, but I think seeing the differences and the similarities are very enlightening. And I think that says a lot about the concept itself, probably more than the people who debate them. Yeah.
Yeah, we also, I feel like this is particularly my public choice sort of background kicking in. I feel like we have to have some healthy skepticism for people who were elected democratically too, because let's not forget that in this entire loss of, sovereignty, the players are people who won elections in the provincial elections in 1946. Right? So in one sense, depending on your point of view, the princely states are villains because they allied with the British crown and they made all these side deals and never quite participated in the nationalist movement. Nizam is like the biggest of the villains because he didn't want to be part of Union of India and so on. But on the other hand, if you look at it as, if we don't take democracy as a given great thing, let's not forget there was a lot of coercion that was in play in stitching the union together, right? When we say loss of sovereignty, where somehow the phrase itself makes it seem like we lost a set of keys, right? Whereas some of this is happening at gunpoint. Some of this is happening with the military being brought in. This is not happening except in a couple of places, in Gujarat or Kashmir with referendum. Everywhere else, it's pretty coercive. There's not much choice. So it's interesting to think about these things having, this 100-year benefit or this 80-year benefit from when the question was first posed. One last question for you. You've written a fascinating article about not just studying the question of federalism, but how we study it depending on where the archives emerge from versus who collects and stores and archives the documents. There's a centralizing versus federal element in that. How does that impact the kind of scholarship all of us are trying to do on the federal question?
I think it has a tremendous impact. So in some ways, it is no accident that I was able to write this dissertation or the kind of articles that I've written because I had access to archives in the US and UK, which have been more successful in retaining archives from vernacular centers and regional centers than the state of India itself. What is very interesting about the Indian archival system is, as you know, there were 560 princely states, and all of them were integrated into British provinces or were combined to create new states and so on. As a result, many of these archives that all of these princely states had fell through the cracks. And we actually do not know sometimes where they ended up or where they are now and so on. So in some ways, there is a kind of scarcity of these materials from the 30s and 40s that would actually allow us to write very, I want to say a more expansive history of federalism than we have when we are only looking at sources from Delhi or London and so on. One of the things that we must accomplish is by writing the history of federalism from the regional centers and from vernacular centers. And I think that is going to be the game changer in some ways, because then the perspectives and the questions and the stakes of these questions are going to be very different. But the existing archival system has a lot of limitations because there's only one law that is legislated by the Indian Parliament, the Public Records Act, which is the only one law that guides the archival management process across the country. And the states have their own rules, which makes it very difficult to access or even ensure that records are properly kept and managed and so on. So there is that problem. I think we should proactively consult materials at the regional and local and vernacular level to kind of balance the views and voices and also bring to bear new voices that existed in the past. I don't know if that exactly answers the question, but...
No, I think you're getting at it because it's fundamentally a question of who gets to write our history, right? And to some extent, just like we talked about in the case of Granville Austin, people who are writing our history are relying on some source material. So then the second order question becomes who gets to preserve our history or call something a historical document. So I think you largely answer the question. It's not as unrelated as it seems at first blush, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think the question of archive is important also because it is very politicized. Because one of the things that I was quite struck by is the absence of certain records about federal debates, even in a progressive state like Travancore. Because it is quite possible that the post-colonial political circumstances of some of these states would have impacted their attitude toward preservation of certain historical records. So, for instance, Travancore wanted to be independent. It was a secessionist state. And we find little about these things within Kerala, but I can find that in London. So that raises interesting questions about whether the post-colonial state of Kerala was not as interested in some of these questions as, So I'm just like, I don't have any clear evidences to suggest, but I think there is a certain kind of irony in saying that you can see something in London and not within the state. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's not that surprising, right? I mean, they're the first to elect a communist party democratically, which wants a clear and radical break from the monarchic past. So it's, in some sense, you're right that you can't say these things for certain. We need more records. But common sense also points us to, we know there are some obvious reasons for why this is happening. And also London has a better records, probably because they were writing to their allies in London on how to resist this huge centralizing force that was coming their way, either through the Constituent Assembly of India or the transfer of power, that was taking place. But this is fascinating. Is this going to turn into a book of some sort? What can I look forward to next?
That's the plan. I'm in the process of revising the dissertation for a book manuscript. And I hope to do that soon. I'm approaching some publishers by the end of this year. Yeah.
Great. I look forward to reading the book. And thank you so much for doing this. This was such a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. I greatly enjoyed the conversation.
Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and at Ideas of India. Also check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.